Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tools and Beyond the Headlines. Have you tried to get your hands on a bike recently? And what about plasterboard or even paint supplies, or perhaps a Porsche with an electric seat? This all might sound a bit obscure, but one of the effects of the pandemic has been to rout the world's finely tuned shipping and supply chains, pushing up prices and causing global shortages of all kinds of products. But don't just blame the virus. The problem may be far more deep-rooted than a symptom of the pandemic, as we're about to find out. It goes to the heart of how business and corporations operate today. We have with us two experts to explain the root cause of all this. They are Mohan Sodhi, Professor of Operations and Supply Chain Management at the Cass Business School in London. Hello, Mohan.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us. You've got the Golden Gates behind you there, which I gather used to work nearby, but you are in Bloomsbury.
In London, yes.
Yeah, okay, great. And we also have with us William Lazonick, the Emeritus Professor of Economics at UMass Lowell. Thank you very much for joining us, Bill. You just need to unmute your button. I have a confession to make as well. I got Bill earlier, 1 hour earlier than I should have done. And I have to apologize profusely. So I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, good to be with you. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. Well, there are two parts to the story. The first is what's happening with supply chains. And then the second is a broader economic one and the corporate drive behind it. And so we're going to divide this discussion in two. The first part will be with Professor Mohan Sodhi, and the second part will be with Professor Lazonick. So some of this is detailed and complex stuff, but I think it's really important. So please do bear with us. Okay, just to start off with, Mohan, can you give people an idea of what is happening? So can we just run through some of the shortages that exist, from cars to semiconductors, just to give us a picture of what's happening at the moment and what's been happening over the past year, Mohan?
Yeah, I think two examples. One is during the initial lockdowns, that was last year, March, April, we had shortages of toilet paper, and those were quite visible. Light, fluffy things that are suddenly missing, and a shortage of pasta on the shelves. And now, after lockdowns are over and people are trying to get back into the economy again, we see chip shortage, which has affected the auto industry greatly. And President Biden is under a lot of pressure to put in some real money. I think $50 billion is the amount to encourage some chip manufacturing in the US. So these chip shortages, I was hoping they're just temporary, but seems like the problem. I predicted about 6 months ago they would last a month. Well, I'm well behind.
I was going to ask you. Yeah, I was going to ask you. But what's the obvious explanation? I'm just guessing here, but just tell us. I presume that people not with shutdowns or lockdowns, people not able to go into factories and factories not being able to produce, and then a dip in demand and sort of ships not being deployed. How does that work? Because there are various things into it.
There is long-term issues, which I think Professor Lazonick will be more qualified to answer. But in the short term, there is the effect of changes in supply and changes in demand. When the lockdown happened, there were changes in demand going down, but also disruptions in supply. Then the lockdown started lifting, people want to buy stuff. Things haven't kick-started enough yet because supply chains are very long, and with the long lead times, many things should have happened several months ago, way back in the supplier, for things to be ready now. And if they're not ready now, either prices go up, and certainly we see the kind of shortages we are seeing.
Okay, so that all makes sense. Let's just talk a bit about supply chains generally, and then we're going to get to the problems behind them. But the just-in-time supply chain, which has been an enormous advance for companies and economies. I think it originated in Japan, but just tell tell me how that works? Give us an example and how that is
So,
linked throughout the world.
just in time actually is innovated by the retail stores in the US, and that was picked up by the Japanese. Anytime you walk into a grocery store and you pick up a carton of milk, that carton of milk shifts up and there's a carton of milk behind it that shifts, takes its place. So, and then every night the inventory gets gets replenished. So that is really just in time. A typical grocery store does not have more milk than beyond a day or 2 days. There's no point keeping 6 months of inventory in a grocery store. It's fast moving as things get used up. And only when they get used up, if some item in a grocery store is moving slowly, is not selling so quickly, then it won't get replenished quickly either. So there's no point manufacturing something unless it's selling. So that is really just in time. You don't really have much inventories anywhere. As things sell, things are made to replenish them, and it goes up the supply chain that way. So a supplier supplies, the supplier to the supplier supplies when the first supplier has already supplied, and so on. And given that the supply chains are quite long, it means there is less inventory in the whole system.
Okay. And we know from previous shocks, like if you go back to the tsunami in Japan, the tsunami and earthquake in Japan, that there have been other sort of global shocks to the system that show that this kind of supply system is very fragile. Can you just give us some examples and sort of warnings that we've had before?
I mean, we've seen that in computer industry as well, not just auto industry. Certainly the tsunami affected, because there were suppliers in northern Japan that supplied many companies, not just Toyota and Honda, but many other companies. So when they couldn't produce because of the tsunami, that affected manufacturing elsewhere. And if you can't get a component, then you can't create an engine or something, which means then the car company doesn't have those things. Same thing happened with hard disks in Thailand in the floods around 2011. And so the computer industry was disrupted worldwide. So these things are happening. The trouble, what we face right now, there is sudden changes in demand and sudden changes in supply. And it's that, in a way, what we are seeing is a perfect storm, because we have geopolitical issues that were going back before COVID struck, and those things are continuing. And in general, there's a lot of uncertainty. Add to that uncertainty created by shortages itself. So it becomes a vicious cycle. Shortages leading to more shortages, leading to more uncertainty, which means people don't invest enough, which leads to further shortages, and so on. Okay. You already mentioned the labor issues, which is affecting containers everywhere. Just this morning, a classmate of mine said in India, he can't find a container to export because containers are mostly stuck in ports throughout the world because they don't have enough people to unload them.
Yeah, okay. So it's having really very real effects everywhere, and it's not just economic. I mean, in terms of things like sort of medical supplies, some of these things are, are vital, literally vital.
Yeah, it's that effect of people rushing out of a cinema theater at the same time. Usually there is enough doors for if people were to exit smoothly, but because everything is being rushed out, therefore people are getting stuck. So.
Okay, Bill, I'm going to come to you now, and I do in a moment. I want to talk about the sort of short-term effects, because there is a big debate about inflation and the impact of what's going on at the moment. So I'm going to use and abuse you to ask about that later. But let's talk about this problem now, supply chains, and what this is a symptom of. And this comes into what you've been talking about for a long period of time. And that really is a lack of investment essentially by big Western corporations. From a sort of basic point of view, why should you have a warehouse stocked full of tons of stuff when you don't need it now? So I could sort of say, look, just in time is good. Why should you bother with something that is unnecessary?
Okay, well, first of all, I think the bigger question here And I think what this shows is that the belief in markets is overdrawn, and markets work when, yesterday is like today, and we can, and just there's a regular business going on, but to get those markets running, to get that investment in place, basically you need relationships. Now, some of those relationships, if you go back historically, many of those companies dealt with it through vertical integration. They produced everything themselves. So they never had a problem of supply. If you think of kind of mass production of cars, for example, back then they weren't using computer chips. I don't think there's ever been a car company that's had its own fab, although, Ford Motor Company had its own foundry, certainly, and, so that's one thing. The other, as those markets also have become more global, and so who gets access to them is more of a contentious issue. And it's what we're looking at. I can talk about it a bit now. Is in the chip industry, it's geopolitical as well as economic about who gets access. But when there are, it's always the case that when there are major changes in supply and demand, and you expect the market to deal with them, they don't do it with it very well. So they don't teach this in the textbooks anymore, but when I started economics, they used to teach about the cobweb cycle in agriculture. Prices would be high, farmers would produce a lot to meet that high demand. There'd be overproduction, prices would fall. Farmers, if they had borrowed money, would go bankrupt. The supply would be inadequate. There'd be shortages. And okay, so what happens? You actually, if you look at the U.S. case where agriculture was very important, it was in the 1920s when this was seen. The government steps in to stabilize prices and to stabilize demand, and sometimes they do warehouse this stuff. Okay, now fast forward into a period where you have electronics are a major industry where we're all dependent on and globally interconnected. Yes, you don't first of all need to warehouse a lot of stuff because you can ship so quickly, and unlike agriculture, you don't have to wait till the next season for it to the crops to grow. But you do have to, if it's a complicated industry, you do have to make the investment. And if you've made a certain amount of investment, for example, the current case of chip shortages in the automobile industry, there's a huge demand also for chips, and these aren't for the highest, the most advanced nanometer process. This is more in the middle. But there's a huge demand for them because of the boom of in the pandemic of people working in their homes and electronic devices. The car companies, as well known, took themselves out of it because there wasn't a boom in their markets, and then they wanted to come back in, and all of a sudden those relationships were not there. The chip manufacturers were saying, well, no, we've committed to someone else. Just one story, this is not new also. Around 1999, I was going through a optical networking factory of Lucent. It's main one in the world near me in Massachusetts here. And the markets were booming for optical networking equipment, but the plant was totally idle. And the engineer in charge of the plant told me, we don't have gyroscopes. Nintendo Game Boys are absorbing all our gyroscopes, and you had multi-million-dollar machines that couldn't be completed and shipped out the door because of this one component. Then a company like Cisco, which was, of course, a leader in enterprise networking, they took a $2.5 billion loss in 2001 because they made, not producing any of these various components themselves, they made a huge order for components to make sure they had them. And then the market turned down, and they, rather than disrupt their supply chains in the future, they took the loss. So this has gone on a lot. Some of this is supply and demand, but it's also the case that there's going to be certain parts of the world where you become increasingly reliant upon to get these produced. And that's also going to bring in some certain geopolitical issues. And that's something that I've been focusing on recently in the semiconductor industry.
Yeah. See, the thing that struck me, and this was because both of you, I've piggybacked on the back of the New York Times here. Both of you are mentioned in an article in the New York Times explaining this phenomenon. And the thing that you spoke about there, Bill, is the lack of investment in both in R&D, but also supply chains as well, because there's this enormous pressure within corporations focusing on their share price. And having an interest, their own interest in seeing that share price going up. And as a consequence of that, a failure to invest and actually becoming less competitive as a result. And I know you can, I've watched a 20-minute lecture that you've done on this. I know you've written papers and you can go into enormous detail, but can you just very simply put that argument here? Just explain how that's been working. Why do companies not have an incentive to invest in these fundamental and very necessary mechanisms?
Yeah, well, I think there's two issues here. One is whether they have an incentive to invest, and in general, even companies they're not investing as much, particularly in the United States, in technological advance as they could, because they're funneling all their money out to their shareholders.
Right.
It's not that they're not investing, but they are using their money to try to prop up their stock price, basically.
And you're talking about 80 to 90% of their turnover going into dividends and share buybacks.
It's their profits. I mean, it's often 100% off 150.
So profits. Sorry.
Yeah. No, it's a little complicated because let me just give you the example of Apple. So Apple, a hugely profitable company. It's spent about exactly since 2013, according to the data that are out there now, $420 billion buying back its own stock since 2013. Okay. Now, if you look, it has plenty of cash because it's still competitive in its markets, but it is vulnerable because if the Taiwanese company Foundry TSMC had decided not to go along with the United States and continue to supply chips to its what had become its second biggest competitor, Huawei.
Yeah.
Apple could have been the one who had been screwed by this. Now, the TSMC, which probably had as much as an interest to continue supplying the Chinese as the United States, was forced into this position actually because the United States does have an advantage in semiconductor equipment, although the most advanced equipment is now coming out of Europe, ASML and Carl Zeiss. But they were able to put pressure on them through shareholding, not to sell to the Chinese. Now, that actually killed Huawei's cell phone business. Now, at the same time, you mentioned the infrastructure bill, and this is one of the reasons I got into it, and that here is the Biden administration, which I think the United States does need to spend a lot on infrastructure, but at the request of the Semiconductor Industry Association saying we're going to put $50 billion into supporting your industry in the United States. And so my problem is that if you look at Intel alone, the leading company, they've spent about that in the last 3 years just on buying back their own stock.
Yeah.
Which is just a manipulation of their stock price. So why should I, as a taxpayer, support them to be competitive in this industry when they're using their money in that way? And the fact is they are not competitive. It's not that they're not producing. It's not that they don't have capacity, and they might buy Global Foundries, which is another big competitor, and get a lot of the middle range capacity. It's that they're not on the cutting edge of technology. Yeah. And that is not so much just because they're not spending, is because the people who are running the company are thinking about how they get the stock price up, and they're not thinking about how they keep their engineers employed, learning processes. These are, once you make that capital investment, it's a incredibly complex learning process to actually get those chips out the door with low defects, and particularly when they're on the cutting edge of technology. And so Intel stopped doing that. Now, going back to Apple, one of the things about Apple, I started looking at this when they started buying back their stock. And basically, actually, there was a first round of this was 1985 to 1997 when Steve Jobs left. And it became a very financialized company, buying back their stock, paying dividends, almost went bankrupt, got bailed out actually by Microsoft in 1997. Jobs came back, he stopped that stuff, and they built their position by just investing in their capabilities. He dies, unfortunately. They bring in Tim Cook. Tim Cook's claim to fame was he's a supply chain guy. He's the guy who showed them how to outsource to Foxconn for production, and set up the chip outsourcing. Now, originally that was to Samsung, but then Samsung became a competitor, so they went to TSMC. And TSMC, the Taiwanese company, would not be the powerhouse that it is if it didn't have the orders, which is just from 2015 from Apple. It's about 25% of their revenues and almost all of their, close to all of their most advanced process. Now, the thing is, TSMC now is, due to pressure from the United States, going to make its first investment in the most advanced, 5 nanometer, not the most advanced, but what is currently operating the most advanced in Arizona. It's going to cost $12 billion initially, maybe $36 billion by the time they're finished. That seems like a lot of money. That's half of what Apple has spent in 1 year buying back its stock.
Incredible.
So back in 2010, 2011, when Apple was becoming very profitable, and this was suggested to Jobs, why don't you spin off some, spend some of your money, hire the people, create your own fab. United States and Apple would be actually in a totally different position now. And TSMC would not have this kind of power globally, or at least they'd have that competition. And of course, Samsung comes in. So, is another company that's made these kind of investments.
Okay, so just to sort of sum that up, so effectively, because of share buybacks, the amount of money going into share buybacks, the creativity, the investment is being taking place in Taiwan and not in the United States. And the amount
it's because at a certain point in time, it might look like Apple has plenty of money for everything.
Yeah.
But you ask over the long run, what are they not doing and what are they doing? And then when they go to the government, what bothers me, well, first of all, they should be paying their workers more. The only time Apple ever got money from its shareholders.
I'm going to come back to that because there is a direct consequences in terms of people's wealth and people's
so
wealth.
income distribution issues.
Mohan, let me just come back to you then. Just give us, because you did say that they should have been investing in the supply chains. Give me an example of what they should have been doing, and then I want to come on to other problems, because we're talking about the pandemic now. We've underlined how sensitive, how volatile this system is, and there are possible threats further ahead, aren't there? So give me an idea of some of the threats, and also give me an indication what they could have been investing in. Okay,
that's a lot of questions in one, but let me just continue the thread from what Professor Lazonick just said about not investing. Not investing had a supply chain reason behind it too, which is the Chinese were happy to buy assets, and the US companies or European companies were happy to lose assets, because when you have less assets, your return on asset goes up. So with the same profit, and the profit would actually increase because initially, or even now, Chinese labor was cheaper than labor in the West. So because of return on investment, it made sense to lose manufacturing capacity rather than to create more manufacturing capacity. And if you were going to lose it, it would be created. And I remember this one company I visited in China. They make 90% of the world's microwaves, 90, because one by one, every company has given up their manufacturing capacity. directly to them, and then they just move the machines back home. And companies were very happy to do that because they made more profits and they had less assets. So the return on assets went up. And so now they have the money, they could buy back their shares or do whatever. So that's one. Now, what companies need to do if, there's the question of managers, whether you incentivize managers by profit or by share buybacks. And Professor Lazonick has already mentioned, once you incentivize professors with shares, then all you get is share buybacks because then the share price goes up. But what companies need to invest in my view, is a slightly old idea called industry commons, which means if there is any shared idea, the idea actually comes from old English villages where you have the commons where any farmer can take their sheep or cattle.
Literally a piece of grass, a common upon which
it's
you
a common
your
to
cattle
all
and your sheep.
Yeah.
It's
so you don't have to pay for it. You can still have your own land, but you can also use the commons because it can be used by anyone. So in a way, the $50 billion in the infrastructure bill being put up by President Biden is a common, because in a way, whatever capacity will be created could be used by multiple companies, taxpayer funded and so on. But commons can be private too. The retailers, for example, rather than saying, okay, this is my warehouse and this is your warehouse, they can have common warehouses where there's, and same thing with trucking capacity, they can use it as a common and share the costs and share the benefits, so they have a more efficient movement of goods. Same thing with manufacturing capacity. If the cost is too much for any given company, then multiple companies can invest together. I was quite surprised to see in Norway, for example, where the population is not very large, you still have companies like Caterpillar and 3 or 4 earth-moving equipment type of companies. So they share the resources when it comes to repairs, because repairs will be in remote
accounting
regions.
and share side. How does that affect their
so it would, there are multiple ways to do it, but one is to create a separate company that handles it, and then the separate company is owned by the competing companies.
Okay. I'm going to look for questions soon from everyone, and I know there are some people who are far better versed in economics than I am who are watching this, and who're going to be able to put much better questions than I can. But Bill, let's come back to you, because the consequence of this shift away from having your own production, the shift away from investment, the shift away from investing in supply chains as well, is that the wages that have gone with those stable jobs have gone overseas, and that's robbed Western developed economies of stable jobs. That's a very rough summary. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah. So I've been a critic of this ideology of maximizing shareholder value, essentially from its birth, because in the mid 80s, I was at Harvard Business School, and in 1984, nobody was talking about maximizing shareholder value. 1986, everybody was talking about it, and the explanation is simple. At one level, the U.S. economy in particular was going in that direction. A lot of changes had taken place in the 70s, from Wall Street investing to Wall Street trading. And also there's a mistaken notion arose, which is still out there among economists, that it's financial markets that fund companies. It's actually either private equity, venture capital, the financial market, the stock market. It's an exit strategy, is the way they get their money out. And then it's retained earnings, profits that fund companies. That's the base of capital formation. But 99.9% of economists will say, oh, it's a stock market funds companies. It's wrong. Okay, the stock market is a value extracting institution, which is a title of a chapter in a book of mine called Predatory Value Extraction, came out recently. Okay, it's a way of getting money out of companies, not putting money into companies. So that's part of what I mentioned at the beginning. Economists have it all backwards in terms of the relation between organization and the market. Organizations invest, markets just circulate the money, goods and money through the economy. Now, problem with shareholder value is that it's rewarding the people who matter least as a result. As I said, Apple, the only time Apple ever got money from its stock market was in 1980 in its IPO. It got $97 million, yet they've given out $420 billion in buybacks, about $106 billion in dividends since 2012 under what they call their capital return program. Well, return to who? Carl Icahn put $3.6 billion into Apple shares in 2013, came out with a $2 billion profit. Not 1 cent went to Apple. Warren Buffett now has about $37 billion originally invested in Apple since 2016. Not 1 cent went to Apple. When Apple does buybacks, Warren Buffett jumps up and down. He's delighted because, as he said, I can go from 5 to 7% of owning Apple without spending a dime. Well, someone's paying that price. And for one thing, it's the taxpayer that's paying the price, because Apple, like every other company, at least in the United States, is trying to avoid taxes. As Tim Cook said when they had a hearing on this a few years ago, they pay every dime that they're legally required to pay, but they lobby like hell to get those taxes down. And the Trump tax cuts in 2017 were all about getting more profit so they could do more buybacks. Everybody understood this, and actually the Democrats were criticizing it at the time. They're doing a little less of that now, but so there's a real problem of distribution. Now, also, when going back inside the company, people don't need jobs today and get laid off tomorrow. People need jobs over a sustained period of time, not only because that's where your well-being comes from, that's where your experience or productivity comes from. And that's a function of companies. So most economists see the wages as a result of supply and demand in the labor market. Okay, if wages are too high, just like the supply shortages, you'll find ways of overcoming that. The way you get higher wages and more jobs and even higher share prices is by companies reinvesting and actually returning that money to shareholders, to the workers, who are the ones who actually are making the investment in creating the profits. Okay. That notion has gone completely out the window. And so as a result, anytime a company is successful, you actually see them squeezing the workers, laying off workers. And even if they do make the investments are usually, if they're trying to get at the cutting edge of technology or even high quality services, they're not going to be successful because their workers are not going to see any advantage in it. Okay. They can work hard today and just get laid off tomorrow. And that's a fundamental problem.
There are many strands here, and I do want to get people's questions. So we are looking at this global supply crisis as a symptom, if you like, of corporate structures. That's one thought. So if you've got questions about I'm addressing people who are watching. If you've got questions about what's going on at the moment, please do ask them. If you've got questions more about what Bill was talking about in terms of how corporations been working over the last 30, 40 years or so. And then, but before we take any of your questions, they're coming in now. Mohan, just remind us, just give us some ideas of other possible shocks that we should be ready for. And we've talked about a pandemic. A pandemic is a colossal one, but we need to think about other things. You've highlighted in a recent paper that this is a problem that has not been addressed. It needs to be addressed because there are other threats out there. List some of those other threats, Mohan.
The other threats, the geopolitics was there before, and it's only going to get worse now because of the pandemic. And geopolitics really means US and China being somewhat loggerheads. The cyberspace threat is increasing exponentially by the day. It's the number of incidents you keep reading about, and the cyber problems in turn increase the geopolitics, because it seems there are not just your gangs, but also country-supported bad actors, and therefore that leads to more geopolitical tension. A big one, of course, is climate change. I mean, this has been a long time coming. I remember reading about it in the 70s and 80s, and seems like we haven't really come to grips with that. And even now people are talking about 2040, or we'll do this in 2040, or we'll do this in 2030. But it's 2020, 2021 now. I mean, when are we going to do anything about climate change? And we can see the impacts every day. And
Right.
if we push it far enough, then there can be collapses in the ecosystem here and there. And then you've got a much bigger problem than COVID and the economy put together.
Okay, well, let's take some questions now. I've compared to, I think it's one of our, we've brought a huge amount into one discussion, so it's a complex one, but we've got some great questions coming up. Let's go to Lynn Maddock. Lynn, you're in, where are you? And what time is it with you as well?
I'm in Melbourne. It's 11 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night, 10:30. A couple of questions. One is just concentrating on the short-term impacts. Do our panelists think that it will cause a restructuring of locations of businesses? Will people act to reduce their supply chains and hence invest more locally than they had? Secondly, and this picks up the geopolitical impact as well, if that were to be the case, and given the current tension and desire to move away from reliance on China, is there likely to be an impact on the Chinese economy, or have the Chinese so much savings that they can just absorb any loss in export markets by pumping up internal demand?
Let's split that question in two. So Mohan, do you want to deal with
I'll quickly, the restructuring of locations was being talked about before COVID hit. And I think it remained at the level of let's talk about it, because even though companies made small moves, but in effect, it was very hard to restructure locations because of the cost advantages. And after COVID, though, it is clear that the Chinese economy is the only one which is really solid. So the money is actually moving into China as opposed to elsewhere. Of course, Chinese companies in turn are looking for cheaper manufacturing locations for non-strategic goods. So for example, making shoes in Vietnam or Cambodia for non-strategic items. So because they are moving up the supply chain. So yes, there's been a lot in the press and a lot being said by politicians about restructuring of locations. But any restructuring of locations is simply supply chains becoming longer and maybe the centers moving closer to China rather than away from China.
That's phenomenal. I mean, in terms of the sort of the geopolitical aspect as well, in terms of your security as well. That's and I guess
what businesses are not listening to politicians, and maybe politicians are just doing what in economics is called as cheap talk. You can say something knowing that nobody's actually listening to you. So you could say anything at all, and businesses are going where there is money to be made.
Okay, Bill, let's go to the second part of Lynn's question then, Bill.
Yeah. Why don't you just repeat what the second part is?
Lynn, go ahead. And Lynn, just say a bit about yourself as well, please, Lynn. Go on.
I'm an old public policy economist in Australia, but industrial policy isn't my field. But I'm also interested in the geopolitics of it all. Do you think that the current difficulties, supply chain difficulties, and the combined with the nervousness about relying too much upon China from the US point of view and the other Western nations, is likely to lead to difficulties for the Chinese economy in terms of their export markets, or can they just pump up their internal demand to pick up any slack?
Yeah. So I think on this, I mean, I agree with Mohan that China has the capability, they have the resources, and they have the people. I mean, part of this, when we're talking about, first of all, going back to supply chain, you're talking about a global labor supply. U.S. high-tech business would not exist without Asian, not just Asian Americans, without H-1B visas, L-1 visas, and it's actually deliberate policy. It was put in place since the 1980s. Most advanced computer science programs and engineering programs would not exist in the United States without Asian students. And basically what happened, for example, in Taiwan and Korea in the late 80s is once those companies in those countries got off the ground, because they had made an advanced investment in education. There was brain drain before that and wages were low, but as wages rose and particularly the demand for experienced engineers came back, there was a huge reverse brain drain. And that now you have these global labor supplies. And of course, the companies are global. So even though it might be an American-based company, they might be employing, they're training Chinese people in the United States and then going back to China with those people, or in the in China with bringing people who are maybe often people who are Chinese want to come back to China. So you have this global competition for what you might call talent. And China and the Asian countries have plenty of it, in part because actually one of the things that started going on when I started seeing shareholder value arise in the United States in the 80s, I was working in New York in the Boston area, was people who would have gone into science and technology in the United States go into finance. And so you started having much more of advanced technological capability developing in Asia. And so now there is very little that the Chinese can't do, although it does take time. I mean, the semiconductor industry, again, is an interesting one because they're leading a semiconductor fab. SMIC didn't get going till about 2000, which was about 13 years after TSMC. They're still way behind, or not way behind, but they're behind. They'll probably end up surpassing Intel, but they will make the effort. It's also one of the interesting things about China is that, and really the secrets to their success is but this is not unique to China. It gets to actually what you might call what Mohan called the industrial commons, which often does come from the government making huge investments in capabilities. The Chinese government has known since the reforms of 1978 in what areas they need to sort of make sure that there's plenty of capacity. Things where you just have to make huge investments to really as infrastructure, including steel, high-speed rail. But where you need rapid technological change, where you need to attract people from abroad, where you need to actually get what we call indigenous innovation, the Chinese have devolved autonomy to business enterprises. You can call them private, you can call them whatever. They're non-state-owned enterprises. Sometimes they're state-owned enterprises. But they let those enterprises operate, keep their profits, reinvest, and grow. And that really has been a big strength of the Chinese economy. And a company that I'm very familiar with, Huawei Technologies, of course, have become the world's leading communications infrastructure company. From there, it went into devices and into enterprise networking, but it's really still by far the world's leading company in infrastructure. Started in Shenzhen in 1987, about 3 years after Cisco was started in Silicon Valley, and next to Stanford in 1984, Shenzhen didn't have hardly any of that capability, and it's been able to attract people and become a world-leading company. By the way, by not going on the stock market, it's not listed on the stock market. It's
amazing. But I'm going to stop you there because Suji has got a question that sort of directly relates to this. So I'd like to bring her in to sort of chip in as well. Go ahead, Sue.
Hi, thanks. I'm really interested in this question of shareholder value because there's I worked in New York in the 80s and in Asia in the 90s in management and business. And it was very clear to me that the whole shift towards this focus on nothing but shareholder value at the expense of R&D, at the expense of human capital, at the expense of everything. The last bailout we had with the banks, the money just got hoarded. It did not go out in loans. So I'm really wondering how competitive can America be if does not reform its business culture. I mean, China is...
Are you talking about an industrial policy, which you're saying, I mean, Bill's highlighted how well China does have an industrial policy, and it's given its state-owned enterprises an enormous amount of freedom to do the right things. Is your expectation that America should be doing the similar thing? When we talk about this, I think it's the Leveling Up program here in the UK, and we expect infrastructure spending here in the UK to improve the economy, but that's very contentious. So what's your expectation? What are you looking to the US government to do? What do you think's the thinking, Sue?
I think the infrastructure policy bill that Biden's trying to push through could help, but there is still this perennial focus on shareholder value. Everything is about the stock price. China recently, as we know in the tech industry, is trying to stop its tech companies from listing overseas. And I really see this as, well, however draconian the Chinese government is, it's like, let us not place everything on profit. Let's think more about the commons that Professor Mohan referenced. I thought that was an interesting concept, because most Asian business culture is about a kind of commonality, which, stock prices just benefits you and me when we invest and sell fast enough, that's all it does. So
Bill, let me come to you.
Bill,
let me come to you in just a second. But Mohan, do you see any sign of intelligent industrial strategy, or the kind of things that Sue's suggesting, Mohan?
No, unfortunately not. I mean, it needs to be done. I mean, if you think about education, for example, high quality education in the US is only becoming much more expensive. In the UK is becoming more expensive, but education can be treated as a commons. If you have high quality educated people, whether in engineering or literature or philosophy or whatever, the whole country benefits, the industry benefits too. Same thing with healthcare. If people are healthy, they'll be more productive. So do we see evidence of that? No, not really, because I'm not sure why we don't see evidence of that. Obviously, the West was built on top of good education, good infrastructure. All those things are commons. They can be used. A good highway system can be used by a transportation company and can be used by individual to visit their grandma. So do we see evidence of that increasing? No, somehow it's decreasing.
Okay, so Bill, more specifically to ask Sue's question again, how viable and effective is Biden's infrastructure initiative?
All right, so basically, I guess what we might all call capitalism, whatever we define it, there's some business enterprises that have autonomy over how they allocate resources that we depend on for most of the goods and services that we use. But those business enterprises would not exist if they didn't have the infrastructure and the people that they can employ and use in doing that. So they, and living in the United States, the United States has no shortage of government investment in infrastructure. I mean, the leading position of US in higher education is because of not the so-called private universities, but because of the public investment going back to the late 19th century in what's called the land-grant colleges, and which were set up engineering and agricultural science schools, and really created a foundation for knowledge creation in the United States, and then interacted with business enterprises. So actually MIT was originally a land-grant college. It was funded by the government through giving land to Massachusetts that was used for engineering education. And General Electric, which is a company totally financialized, but now wrecked by financialization, goes back to that era, and they interacted very closely with MIT in building this advanced technology company.
So it can be done. You're saying there's a precedent for it.
The interstate highway system is almost totally funded by the government. The internet was funded by the government. We have $30 to $40 billion a year in spending from the National Institutes of Health, without which we would not have these vaccines, even though most of them have been developed in Europe. because of the amount of training that goes on around the science, life sciences coming out of the US government. No other government in the world is making that investment. The companies are abusing it.
But Tom, you're all advocating socialism. You know, you're getting government involved in industry. That's what they're going to chuck back at you.
And then we've been living in a socialist society in the United States since the late 19th century, I'm afraid.
Right. They don't want to hear that, do they? So Yuri Vint and then Tom Wood. So go ahead, Yuri Vint, which is, go ahead, Yuri.
Hi, it's actually Louise.
Hello, Louise.
Hi, a question to do with corporate restructure rather than the supply chain discussion. It goes to the sort of shareholder primacy notion. Now, back in 2019, the US Business Roundtable, the sort of peak body for the big corps, moved away, or at least the rhetoric moved away from shareholder primacy and started to reach out to a stakeholder primacy type.
What do you mean by, just for those who don't know, what does stakeholder primacy mean?
Well, it would mean that workers, the environment, the community, stakeholders and other businesses would have a say in how the sort of companies operated. So at the moment with shareholder primacy, certainly the way it plays out in Australia and the US, the investor is prime, their interests override anybody else, whereas this tries to say actually the corporation is set in a society, not just an investor community. So I guess my question is there any move to that, genuine move to that in the US, or is it just rhetoric? But also, is that the response to buybacks?
Okay, but Bill, just I think some people might not be aware exactly of how long shareholder buybacks have been going on and just how much has gone in. And really, you talked about the change since the 1970s. There was I was amazed that effectively companies can manipulate their share prices so readily. But is there do you see potential to curb this buyback?
Sure. I mean, there's people in the U.S. Congress who are concerned about it. Joe Biden is at least was concerned about it because back in 2015, I had discussions with him when he was actually thinking of running for president at that time about this problem. He wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal against buybacks in September of 2016. The odd thing is he mentioned my name in there, and someone asked me, I was telling them about this article. They said, "Oh, send me the link." I went to look a few months ago at the article, just Googled it, and someone had removed my name from the article online. Go look. Just Google short-termism snaps the economy. It says, according to economists, and then there's a blank space where my name used to be. Anyway, the point is, I think there's someone in the Biden administration that at this point does not want him associated with this problem. But the problem is huge. So for US companies, it's about over $6 trillion over the last decade has been used just to pump up their stock price. As I said, I mean, Apple leads the way with 420 billion, but many companies are 5 billion, 10 billion a year. So that's a problem. It started in the 1980s. It's enabled and still is enabled by a rule that the Security and Exchange Commission made in 1982 that no one ever heard of, except now that we've been writing on it. A lot of people know about it, but it was totally under the radar. It was not something that was ever sanctioned by the US Congress, although there's now some efforts to rescind it. And it just took over. Now, the Business Roundtable statement, which was signed by, I think, about, I forget the number, 200 different companies, it was totally cynical. There was one reason that they issued that statement, reversing a position they had taken in 1997 about shareholder primacy. And by the way, that's the year it turns out that buybacks surpass dividends as a form of distribution to shareholders in the US corporate economy. And it's not one or the other. They've been doing more of both, but particularly buybacks. The reason was they thought Elizabeth Warren might become the Democratic presidential candidate, and they wanted to co-opt her. There's no other reason why they did that other than that, and said that we're going to take care of business here. They haven't. So we followed many of those companies and looked at what they've done since that time, and it's totally cynical. They might talk as if they're doing this, but they don't do it. I just read a book by a guy who's now a professor at Harvard Business School named Hubert Joly, a Frenchman who became the CEO of a big retail store in the United States, Best Buy, and said that he turned it around between 2012 and 2019. And he was totally against Milton Friedman, against shareholder value, for a stakeholder point of view. I just downloaded the numbers. That company has been spending more than 100% of its profits on buybacks and dividends while he was CEO. And what he didn't talk about is that he came in there in 2012 with 165,000 employees and pared it down to 125,000 in 2 years.
Right.
So he talks about his turnaround as if it's for everybody, but he doesn't mention the fact that he cut net 40,000 employees in 2 years. He mentions layoffs once, by the way, tangentially in the book. This is going on. So people are
But you're not arguing that sort of layoffs inherently. You're saying that he's got rid of productive jobs as opposed to.
Well, it's not just that. It's First of all, the question is, how easily do you get rid of people? And you can find many profitable companies that are laying off people just because they don't need them, and that's become acceptable. Now that has big consequences, obviously, for their families, but it also has consequences for the capabilities in the economy, because many of these people are people with a lot of education, a lot of experience, could be very productive, but the companies are not using their money to make them productive, and that's the job of the companies.
Okay, we've got 4 minutes left. Just to explain to everyone, we have the top of the hour, we end the official program. If you want to stay online afterwards, we do have a discussion afterwards where we can go into these questions in a little bit more detail. If any of our speakers are able to stay on for 5 or 10 minutes afterwards, I'd love it. If you can't, not to worry, but we finish the official program at the end of the hour, and then we have a discussion afterwards. I want to come back just to a couple of questions about the situation now. So Tom Wood, you go ahead. You've got a question briefly, and then I'll ask another one after that. Go ahead, Tom. You'll need to open your microphone. And if you can't, there you go. Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
I was just wondering how bad the current COVID-related supply problem is. I mean, more importantly, is it getting better? Do you have any sense of when how fast it's getting better, or how much longer it's going to last?
So Mohan, you said a month last time, and you proved to be wrong. So
I'm already 6 months behind that. So same thing about containers. I thought container situation would be solved, but the reality is containers are moving from China to other countries and not coming back. The other economies haven't recovered. And if China is the only country with recovery, and maybe some other countries with small amount of recovery, then trade cannot pick up, and trade doesn't pick up, jobs don't pick up, all those things. Even though there are short-term effects right now, there is shortage of labor, there is wage pressure and inflation and so on. But I think we are looking at a long-term problem now.
I'm absolutely fascinated by that. So Bill, is that something you would agree with? I mean, apart from your whole argument about the way corporations are structured, just as an economist, where do you see the next 6 months, year, 2, 3 years?
Yeah, well, I think actually, when you said COVID, I was thinking, because my group has done a lot on the vaccines and the capacity to produce vaccines, and there's a supply problem that was a result of the fact that no one was really prepared for a pandemic, or prepared the way we should have been in terms of the capacity to produce vaccines. Now, and that capacity is still limited, and what we see is vaccine nationalism. and hoarding. And then we see companies like Pfizer, which by the way is one of the greediest companies in the world, partnered with a company that is not greedy at all, BioNTech.
Well, just in terms of actual economic output, in terms of GDP.
Yeah, but they now want to start producing for the rich countries a third booster shot when the rest of the world does not have the vaccine. Now, I think you can. This reflects on what's going on more generally, because this kind of China and the rest of the world are so integrally related in terms of supply chains, and the whole world is so interrelated that once you get into it gets very geopolitical. There's always some geopolitics, but it gets very geopolitical. You're going to disrupt those supply chains. Some countries are going to be better than others in building their own supply chains. It might take them longer, might take them less time. And you're going to have this kind of balkanization, if you can use that word still, of the world economy. I think actually I'm not an enemy of globalization at all, because I think it brings us together if it in fact advances people's standards of living and there's a sharing of the gains. And I think the United States has gained tremendously from the growth of China. Talk about autos, a company like General Motors would be bankrupt still, went bankrupt in 2009 without selling 3 million cars a year in China. So, the whole world is interrelated. And that's really, I think, what is breaking down right now, particularly around US trade policy, and is exacerbating shortages that come out for other reasons, just supply and demand and lack of.
There we must wrap it up. I hope both of you can stay with us just after the break, very briefly, but just want to say thank you both very much indeed. It's been a very wide range in discussion. So my thanks to Professor William Lazonick and to Professor Mohan Sodhi. Thank you very much indeed to both of you.